A storm tore through a small English village in 1876, a lightning splitting the sky like the scream of some unseen creature. In the Grayson household, two cradles rocked side by side, though the children within were not born on the same night, nor the same year. Locals whispered that fate had tangled their lives in a web too dark to untangle. The twins, so alike in appearance it seemed unnatural, carried a shadow in their eyes, a silence that made even their nurse shiver. Then, on a winter's night, the village awoke to an unthinkable tragedy. Both children were found lifeless, their bodies entwined, as if the world itself had demanded their union in death. What cursed force had followed them through life, invisible yet unrelenting? And why, despite 2 years separating their births, did they die together? Some say it was coincidence. Others say it was fate. Some say something far darker. The Grayson family arrived in the village of Ashwell in the early spring of 1874 under a sky heavy with low, grey clouds. Their carriage rattled along the muddy lane, a wheel sinking slightly in the thawing soil, and the horses snorted against the damp air. Few in Ashwell had seen newcomers from the northern counties in decades, and when the family stepped down, tall, gaunt, and impeccably dressed, the villagers could not help but notice the twins. Though only one child had been born at that time, a girl named Eliza, the resemblance her parents insisted would be mirrored in the second child seemed already etched in destiny. Her eyes, dark as winter pools, seemed far older than her 4 months, and the nurses whispered that she rarely cried, even when hunger or discomfort demanded it. The other children in the village shrieked at her stillness, then mothers averted their gaze, uneasy. The Grayson household itself was a sprawling manor on the outskirts of Ashwell, surrounded by marshy land that crept near the windows. The interior smelled faintly of wax, cedar, and something faintly metallic. The walls were lined with portraits, ancestors staring from oil-painted frames, their eyes unnervingly lifelike. Eliza's nursery, at the eastern wing, was dim and quiet, furnished with pale wood cradles, soft woolen blankets, and a rocking chair that creaked like a sigh with every motion. Life moved slowly for the young girl. Days were measured by the sound of the marsh winds rattling the shutters and the rhythmic hum of her mother's lullabies. The villagers observed her growth with a mixture of fascination and unease. She walked early, spoke with startling clarity, and had a fixation on the family portraits, often staring into them for hours. 2 years later, the second child arrived, a boy named Thomas. From the first moment, he mirrored his sister's traits, the same pale skin, the same dark, ancient eyes, and an unspoken connection that made even their parents pause. Those who glimpsed them together described a silence that seemed alive, a bond beyond normal siblings. From the beginning, Ashwell's residents whispered that the Graysons were unlike any family they had known. Some said that the twins were blessed, others feared they were cursed. But no one could predict the darkness that would follow them, their shadow that would stretch over their very lives, binding them together in ways no one could understand, and in death, would bind them forever. And so the tale of two children, born apart yet bound by fate, began its slow, sinister course. Eliza and Thomas grew under the ever-watchful eyes of the Grayson manor, yet no one could claim they were ordinary children. The villagers often saw them wandering the edge of the marsh, silent and deliberate, eyes scanning the fog as though conversing with unseen presences. Even in play, they exhibited a quiet intensity, choosing shadowed corners over sunlight and staring long into the depths of the marsh as if it whispered secrets only they could understand. Their nurse, a woman named Agnes, spoke little of the twins, though her nights were haunted by their cries, or sometimes, the absence of them. She claimed that, more than once, she awoke to find them standing at the nursery window, staring into the darkness with eyes far too knowing for children of their age. Once, she entered the room to soothe them and found Eliza and Thomas holding hands, perfectly still, their faces expressionless, while a wind rattled the shutters though all doors were closed. Agnes never explained why she felt the air had thickened, as though the room itself had inhaled. School was no sanctuary. When the children began lessons with a private tutor, the young master noticed something unnerving. The twins often completed each other's sentences before the other had spoken, finishing thoughts that had never been voiced aloud. On more than one occasion, Eliza and Thomas would stare past him, beyond the classroom window, as though tracking figures no one else could see. The tutor attempted to question their attention, but found them unflinching, their silence heavier than words. Neighbors whispered that the Graysons kept their children isolated, and it was true in many ways. Invitations to the village were refused, and children were told to avoid the manor. Yet despite this isolation, tales spread, strange glimpses of the twins in the mist, sudden laughter echoing across the marsh at impossible hours, and lights in the nursery windows that flickered without candle or lantern. At home, the children's bond only deepened. They seemed to share more than the usual sibling connection. A glance, a gesture, or a movement would pass between them in a silent language that no adult could decipher. Even their parents, who adored them, admitted unease at the intensity of their link. Friends of the family would leave with lingering discomfort, claiming they felt watched or measured by the children's eyes. And in those quiet, mist-laden nights, it became clear Eliza and Thomas were bound by something beyond mere blood, a bond that would follow them to the very edge of life, where no separation could ever exist. Their childhood was only the opening chapter of a story neither time nor reason could explain. By the age of 8, the peculiar bond between Eliza and Thomas had grown undeniable and unnerving. Those who observed them closely noted a phenomenon that defied explanation. When one child was upset, the other would cry in tandem, even if miles apart within the manor. When one laughed, the other's smile appeared moments later, perfectly synchronized. It was as if their lives moved not by hours and days, but by some secret clock only they shared. At night, the bond revealed itself more starkly. Their rooms were adjacent, separated by a thin wall, yet parents sometimes awoke to whispers drifting from one room to the other, words exchanged in tones that made no human sense. One stormy evening, a candle left in Eliza's chamber flared violently, then extinguished, and in the darkness Thomas's shadow stretched across the nursery floor, though he had remained in his own room. Such events became so frequent that even the Graysons themselves, accustomed to their children's oddities, began to whisper of fate and dread. Visitors who entered the manor reported a palpable chill when the twins were near. A merchant from London described their eyes as too deep, too old, as though the children carried knowledge and grief centuries ahead of their ears. When Eliza and Thomas held hands, he claimed the air seemed to shift, as though something unspoken flowed between them, stirring the shadows in the corners. It was during these years that the villagers began to speak in harsh tones of a curse, that the twins were born apart yet destined to share life's greatest moments, even death itself. Some believed the Graysons had tampered with forces beyond comprehension. Others whispered of an old family legend that one child could not live without the other. Mothers forbade their children from straying near the marsh, fearing that the twins would pull them into an unseen world. Inside the manor, the twins themselves seemed aware of their connection in ways they could not yet articulate. On the rare occasions when one was ill, the other would grow pale, eyes haunted, sometimes muttering unintelligible words as if warning or pleading. Doctors could find no explanation, and no disease linked the twins, no contagion explained the phenomenon. And in the quiet of the marshy nights, the Grayson family began to realize the terrible truth: this bond was not mere coincidence. It was a chain unbroken, tying two lives together. A chain that would remain unbroken until the very end. The villagers did not know it yet, but the twins' final act had already begun to cast its shadow over Ashwell. It was a bleak winter morning in 1882 when the first tragedy struck the Grayson household. A fire had broken out in the kitchen, seemingly minor at first, yet the dry wood and the frozen air allowed flames to leap with uncanny speed. Smoke filled the eastern wing, curling through the halls like black fingers, and the alarmed housemaids scrambled to wake the children. Eliza, then 8, was found standing in her room, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the door as though she could see the flames before anyone else. Thomas, 2 years younger, remained in his nursery, the smell of smoke barely registering to him until his sister's cries broke the spell. Their nurse, Agnes, rushed between the rooms, scooping the children up, but even as she carried Eliza, she felt Thomas tremble violently, though he had not yet seen the smoke. By the time the fire was contained, a section of the east wing had been gutted. The cook was found unconscious, blackened and coughing, and the housemaid suffered minor burns. Yet, miraculously, neither Eliza nor Thomas bore a scratch. Villagers whispered that it was a miracle, or perhaps something more. That night, when the family huddled together in the undamaged rooms, they noticed the children's unusual behavior. Eliza clutched Thomas tightly, and he mirrored her movements, as if sensing her every thought. They whispered to each other in soft, urgent tones, sharing words that the adults could not understand. Agnes, standing in the corner, swore she saw them communicate not through speech but through some silent, almost spectral link, an energy that pulsed between them like a heartbeat in the dark. The Graysons themselves were disturbed, though they kept their fear private. Their neighbors, meanwhile, speculated endlessly. Some believed the twins were protected by God, others feared a curse that kept them alive while others suffered. For weeks afterward, parents warned their children to stay clear of the manor, claiming that the twins were watched over by something unnatural. This event marked the beginning of a deeper dread. The bond between Eliza and Thomas was no longer subtle, it was palpable, almost threatening in its intensity. It became clear to the family that whatever force tied them together, it was both protective and ominous. And the villagers, already uneasy, would soon witness the ultimate, terrifying proof that the Grayson twins' lives and their deaths were entwined in ways no human could control. By the spring of 1885, the villagers of Ashford were no longer merely curious about the Grayson twins, they were afraid. Rumors had begun to circulate, growing like ivy over the cobblestones, tales of children who saw things adults could not, who spoke in voices that carried across the marsh at night, and who seemed to vanish into shadows before returning minutes later as if nothing had happened. At the market, mothers warned each other to keep their children inside. The twins, one whispered, "Look at you and know your sins before you speak." Fishermen swore that on foggy mornings, they saw two pale figures wandering the marshes, staring into the water as if waiting for someone to join them. Even the clergy began to take note. Father Olcott, the parish priest, walked past the Grayson manor one evening and claimed he heard chanting, not in Latin or English, but in a strange, rhythmic murmur that sent chills down his spine. The twins themselves seemed aware of the growing unease. Eliza would often stand at the nursery window, staring toward the village with an intensity that unsettled even her parents. Thomas mirrored her every movement, his small hand reaching out as though touching something invisible. Occasionally, villagers claimed to hear their names spoken aloud in the night, their voices echoing from the marshes long after the children had retired to bed. Strangers who visited the manor noted the silence. No laughter, no childish cries, only the faint sound of footsteps in unoccupied rooms. Dogs and cats refused to enter certain hallways. Servants quit abruptly, citing sleepless nights and dreams so vivid and terrifying that they feared returning. The whispers reached beyond Ashwell. Travelers passing through recounted seeing the children in the mist, their dark eyes fixed upon them with a penetrating intensity. Some claimed to have glimpsed the twins standing side by side at the edge of the marsh, holding hands as though tethered to one another by an invisible cord, their gaze never breaking, even as the fog swallowed them whole. For the villagers, these stories blurred the line between superstition and reality. Children spoke of the twins as though they were guardians or harbingers. Adults murmured that fate, or perhaps something darker, had marked the Graysons from birth. And in the manor, the twins seemed to sense the eyes upon them. They no longer spoke to outsiders, not even the family servants, except in that quiet, urgent language known only to them. The bond had grown stronger, more insistent. It pulsed between them like a living thing, and those who glimpsed it felt a creeping unease, as if something unnatural was stirring beneath the surface of everyday life. The village had learned to fear the Grayson twins, but they had yet to see the force that bound them, a force that would soon demand its final reckoning. It began subtly, in the late autumn of 1887. Eliza complained of fatigue, a pallor creeping across her face that no amount of food or sunlight could dispel. Thomas mirrored her condition almost immediately, not as a coincidence, but as if her body and spirit were entwined with his. Their parents, alarmed, summoned Dr. Pembroke, the village physician, who quickly realized that conventional explanations could not account for the twins' symptoms. Fevers rose and fell in tandem, their pulses striking at the same rate. One night, when Eliza shivered beneath heavy blankets, Thomas's body responded with a tremor of its own. The house fell silent, the servants too terrified to speak, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The doctor, scribbling notes by candlelight, admitted in whispers to the family that he had never seen such a phenomenon. Around the same time, omens began to appear. A black crow perched daily on the gable, staring into the nursery window. Shadows moved along the marsh, stretching unnaturally toward the manor. Servants swore that the children sometimes spoke in unison during the night, repeating words that made no sense, yet carried a weight, a cadence that felt prophetic. Neighbors reported strange lights flickering in the windows when the house should have been dark, and a chill would descend on anyone who dared approach the manor's grounds. Even the children seemed aware of their impending fate. They would wander the halls at night, holding hands and staring out at the marsh, muttering softly in the language they had invented for themselves. Eliza and Thomas shared a secret that no adult could penetrate, an unspoken understanding that they were being watched by forces older than the village itself. The villagers whispered of a curse, that the twins' lives were bound together, that they could not survive apart, and that their deaths would be entwined as surely as their lives had been. Some claimed to see premonitions in the marsh waters, reflections of two children entwined, pale and still, floating above the reeds. In the Grayson household, a dread took root. Each night, the wind carried a hollow moan, almost like the echo of a lullaby gone wrong. The family could feel the tightening of a bond that had begun at birth, one that no doctor, no prayer, could sever. And as the illness worsened, the shadow over the Grayson twins deepened, signaling that the end of their shared story was drawing near, inexorable, inescapable, and utterly silent. The night of their passing was thick with fog, the village of Ashwell enveloped in a cold, suffocating silence. Lanterns swung weakly in the wind, casting trembling light across cobblestones slick with frost. Inside the Grayson manor, the air felt heavier than usual, as if the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. Eliza and Thomas lay side by side in their shared nursery, blankets pulled tightly over their small frames. Their faces, pale as the winter moon, were still and serene, yet their dark eyes, normally so watchful, stared blankly at the ceiling, reflecting no light. Their parents hovered near, whispering prayers, but even the Graysons felt powerless. They had seen the signs, the mirrored illnesses, the strange premonitions, the omens in the marsh, and knew, deep within, that this night would come. At precisely midnight, a wind swept through the open windows, rattling the shutters and carrying a faint, mournful melody from the marsh. The children's hands, previously entwined, clutched each other as if the bond they had shared since birth demanded finality. Eliza let out a single, soft sigh. Thomas mirrored it instantly. It was the only sound in the room, aside from the whisper of wind and the faint, unnatural creaking of the rocking chair that had never been used that night. When the nurse returned from the hall, she found the children still holding hands, their small chests no longer rising with breath. Panic surged through the manor. Dr. Pembroke arrived moments later, but he could do nothing. Both children were gone, their lives snuffed out simultaneously, as if a single, invisible hand had pressed upon them. Their deaths were instantaneous yet carried the weight of something preordained, the culmination of a bond that had begun 2 years apart, yet had never allowed for separation. Word of their passing spread quickly. Villagers whispered of curses and fate, of a bond so unnatural that death itself had honored it. Some claimed to have seen shadows in the fog surrounding the manor that night, two small figures holding hands, drifting toward the marsh. Even those who did not believe in omens could not deny the eerie timing and perfect synchronicity of the twins' deaths. The Graysons, shattered and silent, buried their children together in a single grave under a stone etched only with the names Eliza and Thomas Grayson. But the marsh, the wind, and the fog seemed to mourn them still. Those who passed the grave saw the air grew colder, heavier, and that fleeting glimpses of two pale children could be seen at its edge, watching, waiting. In life, they were inseparable. In death, they remained so, a bond no time, illness, or fate could sever. After the death of Eliza and Thomas, the Grayson manor fell into a suffocating stillness, as though the house itself had absorbed the sorrow of its lost occupants. Rooms that had once echoed with soft footsteps and quiet murmurs were now empty, yet strangely alive. Lanterns flickered without wind, and the floors groaned in patterns that suggested invisible movement. Servants refused to return, citing footsteps in empty halls and whispers in languages they could not comprehend. Neighbors passing the manor swore they saw pale figures at the windows, always two, always side by side. Sometimes they waved, silently, or pressed their small hands against the glass, disappearing when approached. Even the Grayson parents, though never seen outside after the tragedy, reportedly heard knocks at night, footsteps pacing along the hallways, and the soft sound of twin laughter drifting from rooms long locked. Local law grew swiftly. Children dared one another to approach the front gate, claiming to have glimpsed small shadows darting across the upper windows. Farmers tending fields near the marsh whispered that at twilight the two children could be seen walking hand in hand along the foggy edge of the water, their faces pale and unchanging, their eyes unnervingly focused on the horizon. Priests who attempted to bless the manna spoke of cold drafts and an oppressive presence that defied explanation. Candles extinguished themselves when prayers were recited, and holy water failed to produce the expected reaction. Some clergy claimed the twins' bond had left a mark on the house, a resonance of their life and death, the tether between the world of the living and the unseen. Strangers who stayed in the village at night reported nightmares of two children calling from the fog, their voices perfectly synchronized. The twins' image persisted in mirrors long after the room had been vacated. Dogs would howl at empty corners, then even the wind seemed to carry an echo of tiny footsteps across the manor floors. Though the Graysons themselves vanished from records within a decade, the house remained. The villagers spoke cautiously of the property, warning travelers to avoid it. Those who ignored the warning often recounted strange sightings, the fleeting shadows in windows, the whispers that carried across the marsh, and the unmistakable sense of being observed by eyes that were too knowing, too old, for children of their age. The Grayson Manor, like the twins themselves, became a place caught between life and death, a testament to a bond that neither time, decay, nor grief could erase. Even years after the twins' deaths, Ashford remained haunted by the shadow of the Graysons. Villagers spoke in harsh tones about misfortune that seemed inexplicably linked to the family name, and a quiet fear took root that refused to fade. Crops failed inexplicably near the marsh, livestock vanished, and the fog that rolled in from the wetlands carried an oppressive chill that seemed almost intentional, as if the land itself mourned or warned. Families with newborn children began leaving the village, fearful of the Grayson legacy. Those who stayed reported strange occurrences, infants crying with voices older than their aged children staring unblinkingly into corners, then sudden illnesses that mirrored the twins' ailments decades before. Mothers whispered that some misfortune could be traced to glimpses of the twins' spectral forms, always together, always watching. Even the strongest skeptics began avoiding the marsh, especially after dusk. Merchants traveling through Ashwell claimed they were followed by tiny, pale figures along the foggy paths. At first, they thought their eyes deceived them in shadows of fog and moonlight. But those who looked closer saw the children moved with purpose, their gaze fixed and unnerving, mirroring the legend of Eliza and Thomas. They spoke in soft, perfect unison, repeating words no one understood. Some swore they carried knowledge, warnings, or perhaps an accusation, echoing the bond that had defined their lives and deaths. Superstitious villagers began referring to it as the Grayson curse, believing that the twins' entwined existence had left an imprint on the village itself, a warning of forces beyond human control. Strange markings appeared on windows and doors, two small handprints, always side by side, no matter how carefully the surfaces were cleaned. At night, lanterns would flicker as though influenced by unseen breaths. The air carried a low hum, sometimes rhythmic, sometimes erratic, like the pulse of two children forever tethered. Even the local priest, long skeptical, reported that attempts to bless the land or the village were futile. The phenomena persisted, unaffected by holy water or prayer. The curse was subtle but pervasive, a silent reminder that the twins' bond had outlived them, and that Ashwell itself had been marked. Travelers who dared spend a night in the village often left shaken, speaking only in whispers about fleeting shadows, tiny hands pressing at the windows, and the faint, synchronized murmur of voices calling across the fog. The curse of the Grayson twins had not ended with their deaths, it had only begun, spreading its quiet, unnerving influence over the village that had witnessed their lives, their deaths, and their unbreakable bond. By the turn of the century, the Grayson twins had become more legend than reality, whispered across Ashwell and beyond as a story to frighten children and caution strangers. Yet the sightings did not cease, they merely became rarer, more fleeting, and far more unsettling. Those who claimed to see the twins spoke of a presence that could not be ignored, a shadow that existed on the threshold between the living and the dead. Travelers who stayed near the marsh reported glimpses of two pale figures walking hand in hand in the fog, their faces impossibly still, their eyes impossibly deep. Some claimed that the twins had grown in size yet remained eerily childlike, moving without disturbing the reeds or the mist. A few said the children's lips moved, whispering in perfect harmony, though no sound reached the ears of anyone else. Those who attempted to approach were met with a sudden hush, as if the air itself pressed down to keep them away. Local fishermen occasionally found small bundles of reeds tied with delicate thread floating along the tidal channels. Inside were tiny trinkets, toys, buttons, fragments of cloth that seemed far too old and delicate to be of any recent origin. Villagers swore these offerings were left by the twins, gifts for the living, or perhaps warnings of what might come should anyone disturb the marsh. Even the manor, abandoned for decades, continued to draw attention. Windows that had long since rotted shut appeared to glow faintly at twilight. Faint footsteps echoed across floors where none remained, and soft, synchronized laughter was carried by the wind. Those brave enough to enter reported fleeting glimpses of two small, pale figures peering from shadows, vanishing before anyone could step closer. The most chilling accounts came from children. Some claimed the twins spoke directly to them, asking questions in the same unearthly tone their parents had described years before. They appeared not with malice, but with an awareness beyond human comprehension, a knowledge of past, present, and future all intertwined. Those who survived the encounter often emerged pale, silent, and trembling, unable to fully describe what they had seen. Over time, the legend became a constant shadow over Ashwell. Travelers, villagers, and descendants alike learned to respect the marsh and the manor, for the twins' presence was no longer just a story, it was a persistent reality. Eliza and Thomas Grayson, born 2 years apart, died together, and even in death, their bond remained unbroken, lingering in fog, shadows, and whispers across the village they had never truly left. Even now, more than a century later, the story of the Grayson twins persists, etched into Ashwell's collective memory like a scar that refuses to heal. Travelers passing through speak of an unnatural chill near the marsh, a fog that refuses to lift, and the sense that unseen eyes follow every step. Locals rarely speak of the twins openly, but the warnings are clear: some legacies do not die with their bearers. Descendants of the village often recount stories of strange happenings in homes near the old manor grounds. Windows rattling without wind, footprints appearing where no one has walked, and the faint sound of children laughing in perfect unison. In some cases, newborns have been said to stare at empty corners with unnervingly adult comprehension, mirroring the unsettling awareness once attributed to Eliza and Thomas. Parents speak in harsh tones of a watchful presence, a bond between the twins that defies time, still observing, still influencing. The abandoned Grayson Manor itself has become a monument to the inexplicable. Though the building is crumbling and overgrown with reeds, those who venture too close report seeing fleeting shadows of two small figures hand in hand, their eyes too knowing, too old for children. Lanterns swing in the empty halls, doors creak with invisible motion, and the wind carries a whispering that mimics twin voices in perfect synchronization. Even scholars and historians studying the village's history encounter the same phenomenon. Diaries, letters, and local records describe twins appearing simultaneously in two places, illnesses mirrored in uncanny symmetry, then final moments that bind lives and deaths together. These records suggest that the Grayson twins were more than children, they were a force, the manifestation of something older than Ashwell, a presence that refuses to be forgotten. Visitors often leave the village pale, shaken, and speechless. Some claim the twins appear in reflections where no one should be, or linger at the edge of vision, dissolving when approached. Objects tied to the twins' former lives, a discarded doll, a frayed blanket, are sometimes found floating along the marsh to remind us that the bond endures. Ashwell has learned a quiet truth: some ties cannot be severed. Birth, death, and time hold no dominion over what Eliza and Thomas shared. Their story, terrifying and tragic, continues to ripple through the village, a persistent shadow that refuses to fade. The Grayson twins were born apart, yet bound. They died together, yet linger. And in Ashwell, their legacy will never end.